Pain has a way of becoming normal when it lasts long enough. What starts as something sharp and unbearable gradually dulls into a constant companion, something you learn to live with the way others live with chronic illness or permanent injury. For her, that pain was wrapped around the simple, impossible desire to become a mother. Years had passed in a blur of white coats and sterile rooms. She had become intimately familiar with the architecture of fertility clinics, the motivational posters on walls, the magazines in waiting rooms that no one actually read. The hushed conversations between couples who all shared the same desperate hope. She knew which nurses had gentle hands during blood draws and which doctors delivered bad news with actual compassion versus clinical detachment. Her body had been poked, prodded, medicated, and manipulated in ways that stripped away any remaining sense of privacy or dignity. She had endured procedures with names she couldn't pronounce, swallowed pills that made her nauseous, and received injections that left her skin mottled with bruises that bloomed like sad flowers across her abdomen. Each treatment came with statistics, percentages that were supposed to offer hope but often felt like cruel mathematics measuring her inadequacy. Through everything, she had clung to the belief that she wasn't alone in this suffering. Her husband was there, wasn't he? He drove her to some appointments, asked occasional questions about treatment plans, nodded when doctors explained next steps. His presence, however silent or distracted, felt like solidarity. She interpreted his quietness as respect for her pain, his emotional distance as masculine stoicism. She told herself that men process grief differently, that his support didn't need to be vocal to be real. What a fool hope makes of the desperate. The truth had been hiding in plain sight, camouflaged by her own willful blindness. The late-night phone calls he took in other rooms, the unexplained absences during times when he should have been free, the way his attention seemed to live somewhere else even when his body occupied the same space as hers. She had noticed these things, filed them away with explanations that protected her from darker possibilities. Work stress, she told herself, personal struggles he wasn't ready to share. Everyone needs privacy. The revelation arrived not through dramatic discovery but through an almost boring accident. A phone left on a table, a notification that appeared at precisely the wrong moment, a preview of a message that contained just enough information to make her hands shake and her vision tunnel. She stood there, staring at the screen, watching her entire reality reorganize itself around this new, terrible information. He had another woman, not a brief affair, not a moment of weakness, but a fully realized relationship complete with future plans and shared dreams. And this woman was pregnant, very pregnant, the kind of pregnant that doesn't happen overnight, that requires months of development, months during which he had been living a double life with such practiced ease that she had suspected nothing. The cruelty of it was exquisite. While she had been destroying her body trying to create life, while she had been enduring physical and emotional agony in pursuit of their supposed shared goal, he had been effortlessly creating life with someone else. The other woman's fertility was a mockery of her own failure, a living demonstration that the problem wasn't him, wasn't them together, but her alone. She confronted him with the kind of calm that comes from shock so profound it temporarily overrides emotion. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. Instead, he looked relieved, as if he had been carrying the weight of this secret and was grateful to finally put it down. His explanations came quickly, practiced phrases that suggested he had been preparing this speech for some time. He talked about feeling disconnected, about how her fertility treatments had consumed their marriage, about how he had found comfort elsewhere during a difficult time. He spoke about himself as if he were the victim, as if he had been driven to betrayal rather than actively choosing it. He painted her desperation to have a child as an obsession that had pushed him away, conveniently forgetting that this had been their shared goal, their mutual decision. Now that it suited his narrative, her dream became her flaw, her persistence became her failing. She listened without interrupting, watching a stranger wear her husband's face and speak with her husband's voice. Who was this person? Had he always been this selfish, this cruel, and she had simply refused to see it? Or had he transformed into someone new, someone capable of such calculated betrayal? Perhaps it didn't matter. The man she thought she had married didn't exist and probably never had. The family she had married into revealed themselves just as swiftly and just as completely. These people who had welcomed her with apparent warmth, who had called her daughter and sister, who had included her in celebrations and supported her during difficulties, they evaporated like morning mist the moment they learned about the pregnancy. Her mother-in-law, especially, executed her betrayal with surgical precision. The woman who had once held her during crying fits, who had promised that children would come when the time was right, who had presented herself as a source of unwavering support, that woman disappeared entirely. In her place emerged someone cold and transactional, someone whose love had always been contingent on biological production. The phone calls stopped, the invitations ceased. When unavoidable encounters occurred, they treated her with the polite distance reserved for strangers, or worse, for people who had somehow wronged them. The mother-in-law had already transferred her affection to the pregnant woman, already begun treating the coming grandchild as the answer to prayers, as if her years of supporting her daughter-in-law through fertility treatments had been nothing but time wasted on a losing investment. She saw clearly then how conditional their acceptance had been. She had never been family in any meaningful sense. She had been a provisional member whose status depended entirely on her ability to fulfill certain functions: wife, future mother, carrier of the family bloodline. When she failed at these duties, she became expendable, discarded without ceremony or regret. The isolation that followed was absolute. She had structured her entire adult life around these people, their schedules, their preferences, their approval. She had molded herself into the daughter-in-law she thought they wanted, the wife she believed her husband needed. Now, cut off from all of that, she found herself floating in a void of her own creation, unanchored and directionless. The final devastation came dressed in medical authority. She had known, somewhere deep in her bones, that her body was done fighting. The treatments had stopped working. The numbers had stopped improving. But hearing it officially, having a doctor look at her with professional sympathy and confirm that biological motherhood was no longer a possibility, that transformed knowing into reality in a way that left her unable to breathe, she sat in her car in the clinic parking lot for hours after that appointment, unable to drive, unable to think, unable to do anything but exist in the space of her loss. Everything she had sacrificed, every indignity she had endured, every hope she had nurtured, all of it had been for nothing. The dream was dead, and she couldn't even mourn it properly, because the people who should have grieved with her had already moved on to celebrating someone else's fertility. That night, in the apartment that had become a museum of failed dreams, she made her decision with remarkable clarity. She would not stay. She would not fight for a marriage that had been a lie. She would not beg for acceptance from people who had already made clear she had no value to them. She would simply remove herself from the equation entirely. Her packing was ruthlessly efficient. She took only what was unambiguously hers: documents, a few personal items, clothes she had brought into the marriage. Everything else, every shared purchase and joint decision and marital accumulation, she left behind. She wanted no physical reminders of this chapter of her life, no objects that would require her to remember who she had been when she still believed in permanent love. Leaving was easier than she expected. He didn't protest, didn't ask her to stay, didn't even seem particularly surprised. If anything, he looked grateful, as if her departure solved a problem he hadn't known how to address. She understood that she had been an obstacle to his new life, an inconvenient complication he was relieved to see remove itself. His family's silence was even more telling. No one called to ask where she had gone. No one checked to see if she was safe. The mother-in-law, who had once claimed to love her like a daughter, let her disappear without a word. They had already erased her from their family narrative, already rewritten their history to exclude her entirely. She found a small space in a neighborhood where no one knew her story. The apartment was modest, impersonal, blessedly free of memory. For the first few weeks, the silence was overwhelming. She had spent so long surrounded by the noise of medical appointments, family obligations, and marital dysfunction that solitude felt unnatural, almost threatening. But gradually she began to hear her own thoughts again, without the constant pressure to perform, to hope, to try harder, to be better. She started to remember who she had been before fertility treatments consumed her identity. That person felt like a stranger now, someone naive and optimistic, but also someone authentic in ways she had forgotten how to be. She stopped thinking about ovulation calendars and treatment protocols. She deleted the apps that tracked her cycle with mathematical precision. She threw away the medications that had been her constant companions. Each small act of release felt like exhaling after holding her breath for years. The grief was still there, would probably always be there, but it began to change shape instead of the sharp, immediate pain of recent loss. It settled into something more like permanent sadness, a background condition she learned to live with rather than something that actively incapacitated her. Somewhere across the city, her former life continued without her. The baby was born. She eventually heard through distant social connections. They had moved on completely, probably rarely thought of her, if ever. She was a footnote in their story, a brief chapter easily summarized and quickly forgotten. But she had discovered something unexpected in her isolation. She had found herself again, not the woman she had been before marriage, and certainly not the desperate, diminished person she had become during those terrible final years, but someone new, someone harder, maybe, definitely sadder, but also stronger, more honest, more whole. She had survived the unsurvivable. They had taken everything from her, her marriage, her family, her dream, very nearly her sanity, but they hadn't taken her entirely. She had saved some essential part of herself, had protected something they couldn't touch or diminish or destroy. In her small apartment, living her quiet life, she had what they would never understand. She had her integrity intact. She had been tested and had not become what they were: cruel, selfish, capable of such casual brutality. The pain they had caused her was buried deep, but it hadn't poisoned her into poisoning others. And that, she decided, would have to be enough.